Hi everyone, it's Paranoid. I've got a mic attached to my buff here. I'm gonna see if I could do a little bit of reading for you. I've just got all comfy on the couch here, and I'm gonna do a reading of the book If Only They Could Talk by James Herriot. Chapter 1. They didn't say anything about this in the books, I thought, as the snow blew in through the gaping doorway and settled on my naked back. I lay face down on the cobbled floor in a pool of nameless muck, my arm deep inside the straining cow, my feet scrabbling for a toehold between the stones. I was stripped to the waist, and the snow mingled with the dirt and the dried blood on my body. I could see nothing outside the circle of flickering light thrown by the smoky oil lamp which the farmer held over me. No, there wasn't a word in the books about searching for your ropes and instruments in the shadows, about trying to keep clean in a half bucket of tepid water, about the cobbles digging into your chest, nor about the slow numbing of the arms, the creeping paralysis of the muscles as the fingers tried to work against the cow's powerful, explosive efforts. There was no mention anywhere in the gradual exhaustion, the feeling of futility, and the little far-off voice of panic. My mind went back to that picture in the obstetrics book. A cow standing in the middle of a gleaming floor while a sleek veterinary surgeon in a spotless patrician overall inserted his arm to a polite distance. He was relaxed and smiling. The farmer and his helpers were smiling, and even the cow was smiling. There was no dirt or blood or sweat anywhere. That man in the picture had just finished an excellent lunch and had moved next door to do a bit of calving, just for the sheer pleasure of it, as a kind of dessert. He hadn't crawled shivering from his bed at 2 o'clock in the morning and bumped over 12 miles of frozen snow, staring sleepily ahead till the lonely farm showed in the headlights. He hadn't climbed half a mile of white fell side to the doorless barn where his patient lay. I tried to wriggle my way an extra inch inside the cow. The calf's head was back, and I was painfully pushing a thin, looped rope towards its jaw with my fingertips. All the time, my arm was being squeezed between the calf and the bony pelvis. With every straining effort from the cow, the pressure became almost unbearable. Then she would relax, and I would push the rope another inch. I wondered how long I would be able to keep this up. If I didn't snare that jaw soon, I would never get the calf away. I groaned, set my teeth, and reached forward again. Now I'm going to take a break here to remind everyone that this is a book of stories of veterinary procedures, so there may be some talk of death and animals passing away, but these are the terms that the vet has used and are part of the story. Just wanted to let you all know. Another little flurry of snow blew in, and I could almost hear the flakes sizzling on my sweating back. There was sweat on my forehead too, and it trickled into my eyes as I pushed. There's always a time at a bad calving when you begin to wonder if you will ever win the battle. I had reached this stage. Little speeches began to flit through my brain. Perhaps it would be better if to slaughter the cow. Her pelvis is too small and narrow, and I can't see a calf coming through. Or, she's a good fat animal, and really of the beef type, so don't you think it would pay you better to get the butcher? Or, perhaps, This is a very bad presentation. In a roomy cow, it would be simple enough to bring the head round, but in this case, it is just about impossible. Of course, I could have delivered the calf by embryotomy, by passing a wire over the neck and sawing off the head. So many of these occasions ended with the floor strewn with heads, legs, heaps of intestines. There were thick textbooks devoted to the countless ways you could cut up a calf. But none of it was any good here, because this calf was alive. At my furthest stretch, I had got my finger as far as the commissure of the mouth, and had been startled by a twitch of the little creature's tongue. It was unexpected, because calves in this position are usually dead, asphyxiated by the acute flexion of the neck and the pressure of the dam's powerful contractions. But this one had a spark of life to it, and if it came out, it would have to be in one piece. I went over to my bucket of water, cold now and bloody, and silently soaped my arms. Then I lay down again, feeling the cobbles harder than ever against my chest. I worked my toes between the stones, shook the sweat from my eyes, and for the 100th time thrust an arm that felt like spaghetti into the cow, alongside the little dry legs of the calf, like sandpaper tearing against my flesh, then to the bend in the neck, and so to the ear, and then agonizingly along the side of the face towards the lower jaw, which had become my major goal in life. It was incredible that I had been doing this for nearly 2 hours, fighting as my strength ebbed to push the little noose around that jaw. I had tried everything else, repelling a leg, gentle traction with a blunt hook in the eye socket, but I was back to the noose. It had been a miserable session all through. The farmer, Mr. Dinsdale, was a long, sad, silent man of few words, who always seemed to be expecting the worst to happen. He had a long, sad, silent son with him, and the two of them had watched my efforts with deepening gloom. But the worst of all had been Uncle. When I had first entered the hillside barn, I had been surprised to see a little bright-eyed old man in a pork pie hat settling down comfortably on a bale of straw. He was filling his pipe and clearly looking forward to the entertainment. "Now then, young man," he cried in the nasal twang of the West Riding, "I'm Mr. Dinsdale's brother. I farm over in Listondale." I put down my equipment and nodded. "How do you do? My name is Harriet." The old man looked me over piercingly. "My vet is Mr. Broomfield. Expect you've heard of him. Everybody knows him, I reckon. Wonderful man, Mr. Broomfield, especially at calving. Do you know, I've never seen him beat yet." I managed a wan smile. Any other time I would have been delighted to hear how good my colleague was, but somehow, not now. Not now. In fact, the words set a mournful little bell tolling inside me. "No, I'm afraid I don't know Mr. Broomfield," I said, taking off my jacket and more reluctantly peeling off my shirt over my head. "But I haven't been around these parts very long." Uncle was aghast. "You don't know him? Well, you're the only one as doesn't. They think the world of him in Listondale, I can tell you." He lapsed into shocked silence and applied a match to his pipe. Then he shot a glance at my goose-pimpled torso. "Strips like a boxer, does Mr. Broomfield. Never seen such muscles on a man." A wave of weakness coursed sluggishly over me. I felt suddenly leaden-footed and inadequate. As I began to lay out my ropes and instruments on a clean towel, the old man spoke again. "And how long have you been qualified, may I ask?" "Oh, about 7 months." "7 months!" Uncle smiled indulgently, tapped down his tobacco, and blew out a cloud of rank blue smoke. "Well, there's out like a bit of experience, I always says. Mr. Broomfield's been doing my work now for over 10 years, and he really knows what he's about. No, you can have your book learning. Give me experience every time. I tipped some antiseptic into the bucket and lathered my arms carefully. I knelt behind the cow. Mr. Broomfield always puts some special lubricating oils on his arms first, Uncle said, pulling contentedly on his pipe. He says you get infection of the womb if you just use soap and water. I made my first exploration. It was the burdened moment all vets go through when they first put their hand into a cow. Within seconds, I would know whether I would be putting on my jacket in 15 minutes or whether I had hours of hard labor ahead of me. I was going to be unlucky this time. It was a nasty presentation. Head back and no room at all. More like being inside an undeveloped heifer than a second calver. And she was bone dry. The waters must have come away from her hours ago. She'd been running out on the high fields and had started the calve a week before her time. That was why they had to bring her to this half-ruined barn. Anyway, it would be a long time before I saw my bed again. Well, now, what have you found, young man? Uncle's penetrating voice cut through the silence. Head back, eh? You won't have much trouble then. I've seen Mr. Broomfield do 'em like that. He turns calves right around and brings out back legs first. I had heard this sort of nonsense before. A short time in the practice had taught me that all farmers were experts with other farmers' livestock. When their own animals were in trouble, they tended to rush to the phone for the vet. But with their neighbors, they were confident, knowledgeable, and full of helpful advice. And another phenomenon I had observed was that their advice was usually regarded as more valuable than the vet's. Like now, for instance, Uncle was obviously an accepted sage, and the Dinsdales listened with deference to everything he said. Another way with a job like this, continued Uncle, is to get a few strong chaps with ropes and pull the thing out, head back and all. I gasped as I felt my way around. I'm afraid it's impossible to turn a calf completely around in this small space, and to pull it out without bringing the head around would certainly break the mother's pelvis. The Dinsdales narrowed their eyes. Clearly they thought I was hedging in the face of Uncle's superior knowledge. And now, 2 hours later, defeat was just round the corner. I was just about whacked. I had rolled and groveled on the filthy cobbles while the Dinsdales watched me in morose silence, and Uncle kept up a non-stop stream of comment. Uncle, his ruddy face glowing with delight, his little eyes sparkling, hadn't had such a happy night for years. His long trek up the hillside had been repaid 100-fold. His vitality was undiminished, and he had enjoyed every minute. As I lay there, eyes closed, face stiff with dirt, mouth hanging open, Uncle took his pipe in his hand and leaned forward on his straw bale. You're about beat, young man, he said with deep satisfaction. Well, I've never seen Mr. Broomfield beat, but he's had a lot of experience. And what's more, he's strong, really strong. That's one man you couldn't tire. Rage flooded through me like a draught of strong spirit. The right thing to do, of course, would be to get up, tip the bucket of bloody water over Uncle's head, run down the hill, and drive away. Away from Yorkshire, from Uncle, from the Dinsdales, from this cow. Instead, I clenched my teeth, braced my legs, and pushed with everything I had. And with a sensation of disbelief, I felt my noose slide over the sharp little incisor teeth and into the calf's mouth. Gingerly muttering a prayer, I pulled on the thin rope with my left hand and felt the slip knot tighten. I had hold of that lower jaw. At last I could start doing something. Now hold this rope, Mr. Dinsdale, and just keep a gentle tension on it. I'm going to repel the calf, and if you pull steadily at the same time, the head ought to come around. What if the rope comes off? Asked Uncle hopefully. I didn't answer. I put my hand in against the calf's shoulder and began to push against the cow's contractions. I felt the small body moving away from me. Now, a steady pull, Mr. Dinsdale, without jerking. And to myself, oh God, don't let it slip off. The head was coming round. I could feel the neck straightening against my arm. Then the ear touched my elbow. I let go the shoulder and grabbed the little muzzle. Keeping the teeth away from the vaginal wall with my hand, I guided the head till it was resting where it should be, on the forelimbs. Quickly I extended the noose till it reached the ears. Now pull on the head as she strains. Nay, you should pull on the legs now, cried Uncle. Pull on the bloody head rope, I tell you, I bellowed at the top of my voice, and felt immediately better as Uncle retired, offended, to his bale. With traction, the head was brought out, and the rest of the body followed easily. The little animal lay motionless on the cobbles, eyes glassy and unseeing, tongue blue and grossly swollen. It'll be dead, bound to be, grunted Uncle, returning to the attack. I cleared the mucus from the mouth, blew hard down the throat, and began artificial respiration. After a few pressures on the ribs, the calf gave a gasp and the eyelids flickered. Then it started to inhale and one leg jerked. Uncle took off his hat and scratched his head in disbelief. By God, it's alive. I thought it'd sure be dead after you'd messed about all that time. A lot of the fire had gone out of him, and his pipe hung down empty from his lips. I know what this little fellow wants, I said. I grasped the calf by its forelegs and pulled it up to its mother's head. The cow was stretched out on her side, her head extended wearily along the rough floor. Her ribs heaved, her eyes were almost closed. She looked past caring about anything. Then she felt the calf's body against her face, and there was a transformation. Her eyes opened wide, and her muzzle began a snuffling exploration of the new object. Her interest grew with every sniff, and she struggled onto her chest, nosing and probing all over the calf, rumbling deep in her chest. Then she began to lick him methodically. Nature provides the perfect stimulant massage for a time like this, and the little creature arched his back at the coarse palpellae on the tongue, dragged along the skin. Within a minute he was shaking his head and trying to sit up. I grinned. This was the bit I liked, the little miracle. I felt it was something that would never grow stale, no matter how often I saw it. I cleaned as much of the dried blood and filth from my body as I could, and most of it had caked on my skin, and not even my fingernails would move it. I would have to wait for a hot bath at home. Pulling my shirt over my head, I felt as though I had been beaten for a long time with a thick stick. Every muscle ached. My mouth was dried out, my lips almost sticking together. A long, sad figure hovered near. How about her drink? asked Mr. Dinsdale. I could feel my grimy face cracking into an incredulous smile. A vision of hot tea, well laced with whiskey, swam before me. That's very kind of you, Mr. Dinsdale. I'd love a drink. It's been a hard 2 hours. Nay, Mr. Dinsdale looked at me steadily. I meant for the cow. I began to babble. Oh, yes, of course, certainly. By all means, give her a drink. She must be very thirsty. It'll do her good. Certainly, give her a drink. I gathered up my tackle and stumbled out of the barn. On the moor, it was still dark, and a bitter wind whipped over the snow, stinging my eyes. As I plodded down the slope, Uncle's voice, strident and undefeated, reached me for the last time. Mr. Broomfield doesn't believe in giving a drink after calving. Says it chills the stomach. Oh, boy. Let's go on. Chapter 2. It was hot in the rickety little bus, and I was on the wrong side where the July sun beat on the windows. I shifted uncomfortably inside my best suit and eased a finger around the constricting white collar. It was a foolish outfit for this weather, but a few miles ahead, my prospective employer was waiting for me, and I had to make a good impression. There was a lot hanging on this interview. Being a newly qualified vet surgeon in this year of 1937 was like taking out a ticket for the dole queue. Agriculture was depressed by a decade of government neglect. The draught horse, which had been the mainstay of the profession, was fast disappearing. It was easy to be a prophet of doom when the young men emerging from the colleges after a hard 5-year slog were faced by a world indifferent to their enthusiasm and bursting knowledge. There were usually 2 or 3 situations vacant in the Record each week, and an average of 80 applicants for each one. It didn't seem true when the letter came from Derby in the Yorkshire Dales. Mr. Siegfried Farron, M.R. CVS, would like to see me on Friday afternoon. I was to come to tea, and if we were mutually suited, I could stay on as an assistant. I had grabbed at the lifeline unbelievingly. So many friends who had qualified with me were unemployed or working in shops or as laborers in the shipyards that I had given up hope of any other future for myself. The driver crashed his gears again as he went to another steep bend. We had been climbing steadily now for the last 15 miles or so, moving closer to the distant blue swell of the Pennines. Pennines, not peonies. Pennines. I had never been in Yorkshire before, but the name had always raised a picture of a county as stodgy and unromantic as its pudding. I was prepared for solid worth, dullness, and a total lack of charm. But as the bus groaned its way higher, I began to wonder. The formless heights were resolving into high, grassy hills and wide valleys. In the valley bottoms, rivers twisted among the trees, and solid gray stone farmhouses lay among islands of cultivated land, which pushed bright green promontories up the hillsides into the dark tide of heather which lapped from the summits. I had seen the fences and hedges give way to dry stone walls which bordered the roads, enclosed the fields, and climbed endlessly over the surrounding fells. The walls were everywhere, countless miles of them, tracing their patterns high on the green uplands. But as I neared my destination, the horror stories kept forcing their way into my mind. The tales brought back to college by veterans hardened and embittered by a few months of practice. Assistants were just little bits of dirt to be starved and worked into the ground by their principals, who were heartless and vicious to a man. Dave Stevens, lighting a cigarette with a trembling hand. Never a night off, or a half day. He made me wash the car, dig the garden, mow the lawn, do the family shopping. But when he told me to sweep the chimney, I left. Or Willie Johnson. First job I had to do was pass the stomach tube on a horse. Got it into the trachea instead of the esophagus. Couple of quick pumps and down went the horse. With a hell of a crash, dead as a hammer. That's when I started these gray hairs. Or the dreadful one they passed around about Fred Pringle. Fred had trocarized a bloated cow, and the farmer had been so impressed by the pent-up gas hissing from the abdomen that Fred had got carried away and applied his cigarette lighter to the cannula. A roaring sheet of flame had swept on to some bales and burned the briar to the ground. Fred had to be taken. Oh, our Lord. Fred had taken up a colonial appointment immediately afterwards. Leeward Islands, wasn't it? Oh, hell, that one couldn't be true. I cursed my fevered imagination and tried to shut out the cackling of the inferno, the terrified bellowing of the cattle as they were led to safety. No, it couldn't be as bad as that. I rubbed my sweating palms on my knees and tried to concentrate on the man I was going to meet. Siegfried Vernon. Strange name for a vet in the Yorkshire Dales. Probably a German who had done his training in this country and decided to set up practice. And it wouldn't have been Farnan in the beginning. Probably Farnan. Yes, Siegfried Farnan. He was beginning to take shape. Short, fat, roly-poly type with merry eyes and a bubbling laugh. But at the same time, I had trouble with the obtruding image of a hulking, cold-eyed, bristle-skulled Teuton, more in keeping with the popular idea of the practice boss. I realized the bus was clattering along a narrow street, which opened onto a square when we stopped. Above the window of the unpretentious grocer shop, I read Darrowby Cooperative Society. We had arrived. I got out and stood beside my battered suitcase, looking about me. There was something unusual, and I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I realized what it was. The silence. The other passengers had dispersed, and the driver had switched off his engine, and there was not a sound or a movement anywhere. The only visible sign of life was a group of old men sitting around the clock tower in the center of the square. But they might have been carved from stone. Darrowby didn't get much space in the guidebooks, but when it was mentioned, it was described as a grey little town on the River Darrow with a cobbled marketplace and little of interest except its two ancient bridges. But when you looked at it, its setting was beautiful on the pebbly river where the houses clustered thickly and straggled unevenly along the lower slopes of Herne Fell. Everywhere in Darrowby, in the streets, through the windows of the houses, you could see the fell rearing its calm green bulk more than 2,000 feet above the huddled roofs. There was a clarity in the air, a sense of space and airiness that made me feel I had shed something on the plain 20 miles behind. The confinement of the city, the grime, the smoke, already they seemed to be falling away from me. Trengate was a quiet street leading off the square, and I had my first sight of Skeldale House. I knew it was the right place before I was near enough to read S. Farnan, M.R.C.V.S. on the old-fashioned brass plate hanging slightly askew on the iron railings. I knew by the ivy which climbed untidily over the mellow brick to the topmost windows. It was what the letter had said, the only house with ivy. This could be where I would work for the first time as a veterinary surgeon. Now that I was here, right on the doorstep, I felt breathless, as though I had been running. If I got the job, this was where I would find out about myself. There were many things to prove, but I liked the look of the old house. It was Georgian with a fine white painted doorway. The windows too were white, wide and graceful on the ground floor and the first story, but small and square where they peeped out from under the overhanging tiles far above. The paint was flaking and the mortar looked crumbly between the bricks, but there was a changeless elegance about the place. There was no front garden, and only the railing separated the house from the street a few feet away. I rang the doorbell, and instantly the afternoon peace was shattered by a distant baying like a wolf pack in full cry. The upper half of the door was of glass, and as I peered through, a river of dogs poured around the corner of a long passage and dashed itself with frenzied yells against the door. If I hadn't been used to animals, I would have turned and run for my life. As it was, I stepped back warily and watched the dogs as they appeared, sometimes two at a time, at the top of their leap, eyes glaring, jaws slavering. After a minute or two of this, I was able to sort them out. I realized that they were that my first rough count of about 14 was exaggerated. There were, in fact, 5. A huge fawn greyhound who appeared most often, as he hadn't so far to jump as the others. A cocker spaniel, a Scottie, a whippet, and a tiny short-legged hunt terrier. This terrier was seldom seen, since the glass was rather high for him. But when he did make it, he managed to get an even more frantic note into his bark before he disappeared. I was thinking of ringing the bell again when I saw a large woman in the passage. She rapped out a single word, and the noise stopped as if by magic. When she opened the door, the ravening pack was slinking around her feet ingratiatingly, showing the whites of their eyes and wagging their tucked-in tails. I had never seen such a servile crew. "Good afternoon," I said with my best smile. "My name is Harriet." The woman looked bigger than ever with the door open. She was about 60, but her hair, tightly pulled back from her forehead, was jet black and hardly streaked with grey. She nodded and looked at me with grim benevolence, but she seemed to be waiting for further information. Evidently, the name struck no answering spark. "Mr. Farnan is expecting me. He wrote me asking me to come today." "Mr. Harriet?" she said thoughtfully. "Surgery is from 6 to 7 o'clock. If you wanted to bring a dog in, that would be your best time." No, I said, hanging on to my smile. "I'm applying for the position of assistant. Mr. Farnan said to come in time for tea." "Assistant? Well, no, that's nice." The lines in her face softened a little. "I'm Mrs. Hall. I keep house for Mr. Farnan. He's a bachelor, you know. He never said anything to me about you. But never mind. Come in and have a cup of tea. He shouldn't be long before he's back." I followed her between whitewashed walls, my feet clattering on the tiles. We turned right at the end into another passage, and I was beginning to wonder just how far back the house extended. When I was shown into a sunlit room. It had been built in the grand manner, high-ceilinged and airy, with a massive fireplace flanked by arched alcoves. One end was taken up by a French window, which gave on a long, high-walled garden. I could see unkempt lawns, a rockery, and many fruit trees. A great bank of peonies blazed in the hot sunshine at the far end. Rooks cawed in the branches of a group of tall elms. Above and beyond were the green hills with their climbing walls. Ordinary-looking furniture stood around on a very worn carpet. Hunting prints hung on the walls, and books were scattered everywhere, some on shelves in the alcoves, but others piled on the floor in the corners. A pewter pint pot occupied a prominent place at one end of the mantelpiece. It was an interesting pot. Checks and banknotes had been stuffed into it till they bulged at the top and overflowed to the hearth below. I was studying this with astonishment when Mrs. Hall came in with a tea tray. "I suppose Mr. Farnan is out on a case," I said. "No, he's gone through to Broughton to visit his mother. I couldn't really say when he'll be back." She left me with my tea. The dogs arranged themselves peacefully around the room, and except for a brief dispute between the Scottie and the cocker spaniel about the occupancy of a deep chair, there was no sign of their previous violent behavior. They lay regarding me with friendly boredom, and at the same time fighting a losing battle against sleep. Soon the last nodding head had fallen back, and the chorus of heavy breathing filled the room. But I was unable to relax with them. A feeling of letdown gripped me. I had screwed myself up for an interview, and I was left dangling. This was all very odd. Why should anyone write for an assistant, arrange a time to meet him, and then go to visit his mother? Another thing, if I was engaged, I would be living in this house, yet the housekeeper had no instructions to prepare a room for me. In fact, she had never even heard of me. My musings were interrupted by the doorbell ringing, and the dogs, as if touched by a live wire, leaped screaming into the air and launched themselves in a solid mass through the door. I wished they didn't take their duties so seriously. There was no sign of Mrs. Hall, so I went out to the front door where the dogs were putting everything into the fierce act. "Shut up!" I shouted, and the din switched itself off. The 5 dogs cringed abjectly around my ankles, almost walking on their knees. The big greyhound got the best effect by drawing his lips back from his teeth in an apologetic grin. I opened the door and looked into a round, eager face. Its owner, a plump man in Wellington boots, leaned confidently against the railings. Hello, Mr. Farnahan. Not at the moment. Can I help you? I give him a message when he comes in. Tell him Bert Sharp of Barrow Hills has a cow what needs boring out. Boring out? That's right. She's got on 3 cylinders. 3 cylinders? Aye, and if we don't do summat, she'll go rang over ewer, won't she? Very probably. We don't want felon, do we? Certainly not. Oh, okay, you tell him. Then, ta-ta. I returned thoughtfully to the sitting room. It was disconcerting, but I had listened to my first case history without understanding a word of it. I had hardly sat down again when the bell rang again. This time I unleashed a frightening yell which froze the dogs when they were still in mid-air. They took the point and returned abashed to their chairs. This time it was a solemn gentleman with a straightly adjusted cloth cap resting on his ears. A muffler nodded precisely over his Adam's apple, and a clay pipe growing from the exact center of his mouth. He removed the pipe and spoke with a rich, unexpected accent. "Me name's Mulligan, and I want Mr. Farnan to make up some medicine for me dog." "Oh, what's the trouble with your dog, Mr. Mulligan?" He raised a questioning eyebrow and put a hand to his ear. I tried again with a full-blooded shout. "What's the trouble?" He looked at me doubtfully for a moment. "He's vomiting, sir. Vomiting bad." I immediately felt on secure ground, and my brain began to seethe with diagnostic procedures. How long after eating does he vomit? The hand went to the ear again. "What's that?" I leaned close to the side of his head, inflated my lungs, and bawled, "When does he vomit? I mean vomit." Comprehension slowly came across Mr. Mulligan's face. He gave a gentle smile. He vomited bad, sir." I didn't feel up to another effort, so I told him I would see to it and asked him to call later. He must have been able to lip-read me because he seemed satisfied and walked away. Back in the sitting room, I sank into a chair and poured a cup of tea. I had taken 1 sip when the bell rang again. This time, a wild glare from me was enough to make the dogs cower back in their chairs. I was relieved they had caught on so quickly. Outside the front door, a lovely red-haired girl was standing. She smiled, showing a lot of very white teeth. "Good afternoon," she said in a loud, well-bred voice. "I am Diana Brompton. Mr. Farnan is expecting me for tea." I gulped and clung to the door handle. "He asked you to tea?" The smile became fixed. "Yes, that is correct," she said, spelling the words out carefully. "He asked me to tea." "I'm afraid Mr. Farnan isn't home. I can't say when he'll be back." The smile was plucked away. "Oh," she said, and she got a lot into that word. "At any rate, perhaps could I come in?" "Oh, certainly, do come in." "I'm sorry," I babbled, suddenly conscious that I had been staring open-mouthed at her. I held the door open, and she brushed past me without a word. She knew her way about because when I got to the first corner, she had disappeared into the room. I tiptoed past the door and broke into a gallop, which took me along another 30 yards or so of twisting passage to a huge stone-flagged kitchen. Mrs. Hall was pottering there, and I rushed at her. "There's a young lady here, Miss Brompton. She's come to tea, too. I I had to fight an impulse to pluck at her sleeve. Mrs. Hall's face was expressionless. I thought she might have started to wave her arms about, but she didn't even seem surprised. You go through and talk to her, and I'll bring a few more cakes, she said. What the heck am I going to talk to her about? How long is Mr. Farnan going to be? Oh, just chat to her for a bit. I shouldn't think you'll be very long, she said calmly. Slowly I made my way back to the sitting room, and when I opened the door, the girl turned quickly with the makings of another big smile. She made no attempt to hide her disgust when she saw it was only me. Mrs. Hall thinks he should be back fairly soon. Perhaps you would like to join me for a cup of tea while you're waiting? She gave me a quick glance which raked me from my rumpled hair to my scuffed old shoes. I realized suddenly how grimy and sweaty I was after the long journey. Then she shrugged her shoulders and turned away. The dogs regarded her apathetically. A heavy silence blanketed the room. I poured a cup of tea and held it out to her. She ignored me and lit a cigarette. This was going to be tough, and I could only try. I cleared my throat and spoke lightly. I only just arrived myself. I hope to be the new assistant. This time she didn't trouble to look around. She just said, "Oh." And again, the monosyllable carried a tremendous punch. Lovely part of the world, this, I said, returning to the attack. Yes. I've never been to Yorkshire before, but I like what I've seen. Oh. Have you known Mr. Farnan very long? Yes. I believe he's quite young, about 30? Yes. Wonderful weather. Yes. I kept at it with courage and tenacity for about 5 minutes, hunting for something original or witty, but finally Miss Brompton, instead of answering, took the cigarette from her mouth, turned towards me, and gave me a long blank stare. I knew that was the end and shrank into silence. After that, she sat staring out the French window, pulling deeply at her cigarette, narrowing her eyes as the smoke trickled from her lips. As far as she was concerned, I just wasn't there. I was able to observe her at will, and she was interesting. I had never met a living piece of society magazine before. Cool linen dress, expensive-looking cardigan, elegant legs, and the glorious red hair falling on her shoulders. And yet here was a fascinating thought. She was sitting there, positively hungering for a little fat German vet. This Farnan must have something. The tableau was finally broken up when Miss Brompton jumped to her feet. She hurled her cigarette savagely into the fireplace and marched from the room. Wearily, I got up out of my chair. My head began to ache as I shuffled through the French window into the garden. I flopped down among the knee-deep grass on the lawn and rested my back against a towering acacia tree. Where the devil was Farnan? Was he really expecting me, or somebody played a horrible practical joke on me? Or had somebody played a horrible practical joke on me? I felt suddenly cold. I had spent my last few pounds getting there, and if there was some mistake, I was in trouble. But looking around me, I began to feel better. The sunshine beat back from the high old walls. Bees droned among the bright masses of flowers. A gentle breeze stirred the withered blooms of a magnificent wisteria which almost covered the back of the house. There was peace here. I leaned my head against the bark and closed my eyes. I could see Herr Farnan, looking just as I had imagined him, standing over me. He wore a shocked expression. "What is this you have done?" he sputtered, his fat jowls quivering with rage. "You come into my house under false pretenses. You insult Fräulein Brompton. You drink my tea. You eat my food. What else have you done, hein? Maybe you steal my spoons. You talk about assistants. By what no assistant? It is best I telephone the police." Herr Farnan seized the phone in a pudgy hand. Even in my dream, I wondered how the man could use such a completely corny accent. I heard the thick voice saying, "Hello, hello," and I opened my eyes. Somebody was saying hello, but it wasn't Herr Farnan. A tall, thin man was leaning against the wall, his hands in his pockets. Something seemed to be amusing him. As I struggled to my feet, he heaved himself away from the wall and held out his hand. Sorry you've had to wait. I'm Siegfried Fernan. He was just about the most English-looking man I had ever seen. Long, humorous, strong-jawed face, small clipped mustache, untidy, sandy hair. He was wearing an old tweed jacket and shapeless flannel trousers. The collar of his check shirt was frayed and the tie carelessly knotted. He looked as though he didn't spend much time in front of a mirror. Studying him, I began to feel better despite the ache in my neck where it had rested against the tree. I shook my head to get my eyes fully open, and tufts of grass fell from my hair. There was Miss Brompton here, I blurted. She came to tea. I explained you had been called away. Farnan looked thoughtful, but not put out. He rubbed his chin slowly. Yes, well, never mind. But I do apologize for being out when you arrived. I have a shocking memory, and I just forgot. It was the most English voice, too. Farnan gave me a long, searching look. Then he grinned. Let's go inside. I want to show you around the place. And that is it for chapter 2. And that brings us to almost 30 minutes of reading. Maybe just a little bit underneath. So I'm going to upload this and give it a test and see if you like the reading style. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a good morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are, and that you are comfy and warm.